Have you ever witnessed true brotherhood in action? The kind that transcends time, distance, and even the most difficult circumstances. What you're about to hear is the story of a disabled Marine veteran who was humiliated and pushed out of a local bar one Friday night in San Diego. The bar staff and some patrons thought they could disrespect someone who had sacrificed everything for their freedom, but they had no idea who they were messing with. They couldn't have known that just a few miles away, at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, an elite team of warriors was gathered for a reunion. Warriors who lived by a code that most civilians will never understand. No man left behind. In just 30 minutes, that bar would witness something they'd never forget. The arrival of men who had fought in the darkest corners of the world. Men who would never abandon one of their own. Stay with me until the end to discover how these Navy SEALs responded when they learned what happened to their brother in arms and the powerful lesson they taught everyone in that bar about respect, honor, and the unbreakable bonds formed in combat. Welcome to Honor Echoes, where we bring you the most powerful, moving, and sometimes shocking stories of our nation's veterans. Stories that need to be told. Stories that deserve to be heard. I'm passionate about sharing these accounts because they reveal the true character of the men and women who serve our country. Their courage, their sacrifice, and the brotherhood that binds them together, long after they've hung up their uniforms. Before we dive into today's powerful story about a disabled veteran and the Navy SEALs who had his back, take a moment to subscribe to Honor Echoes. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell, so you never miss these important stories that showcase the unbreakable bonds formed in military service. By subscribing, you're not just following a channel, you're joining a community that honors veterans and ensures their stories are never forgotten. You're helping preserve the legacy of those who gave everything for our freedom. Now, let's get back to that fateful Friday night in San Diego, when a disabled Marine veteran named Mike Hendricks walked into the wrong bar, not knowing that this uncomfortable encounter would lead to one of the most powerful demonstrations of military brotherhood ever witnessed. Mike Hendricks had never considered himself a hero, not when he'd served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, not when he'd led his squad through the deadly corridors of Sangin Valley in 2010, one of the bloodiest battlegrounds American forces had encountered in the War on Terror. And certainly not now, as he maneuvered his wheelchair through the crowded sidewalks of San Diego's Gaslamp Quarter on a humid Friday evening in July. At 34, Mike's face carried the weathered lines of someone who'd seen too much, too soon. His powerful upper body, built through years of adaptation to life without legs, propelled his wheelchair with practiced precision. The prosthetics he sometimes wore for special occasions remained at home tonight. He just wanted a quiet drink, maybe some conversation at one of the local spots. It had been 5 years since the IED that took both his legs just above the knee. 5 years of surgeries, phantom pains, and the grueling process of rebuilding not just his body, but his sense of identity. The Marines had been his life for 12 years. Now civilian life still felt like an ill-fitting uniform he was forced to wear. Tonight was the anniversary of the ambush that had claimed 2 of his men. Staff Sergeant Derek Coleman and Lance Corporal James Martinez had died instantly when their patrol was hit. Mike had dragged 3 others to safety before the second explosion took his legs. He didn't talk about that day often, but he always honored it with quiet remembrance. The neon sign of the Lighthouse Lounge cast a blue glow across the sidewalk. Mike had never been to this particular bar, but it looked less crowded than the others on the strip. He could use the space tonight. Navigating his chair through packed bars was an exercise in patience he wasn't in the mood for. The bouncer at the door, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a tight black t-shirt stretched across his chest, looked down at Mike with a frown. "You sure you want this place, buddy? Not exactly wheelchair-friendly in there." Mike had heard variations of this before. "I'll manage, always do." The bouncer shrugged and stepped aside. Your call. Inside, the lighthouse lounge was dimly lit with an attempt at upscale maritime decor. Ship wheels and anchors on the walls, blue lighting meant to evoke the ocean. A long, polished bar stretched along one wall, and various high-top tables filled the center space. Mike immediately noted the problem. There wasn't a single regular height table in the establishment. He wheeled toward the bar, where at least the counter height might work. A few patrons glanced his way, their expressions shifting from casual curiosity to that distinct look of awkward pity that Mike had come to recognize instantly. He ignored them. The bartender, a man in his 30s with slicked back hair and a carefully trimmed beard, looked at Mike with visible discomfort. "What can I get you?" he asked, his eyes darting from Mike's face to his wheelchair and back. "Jack and Coke," Mike replied. "Double." "Eh?" As the bartender prepared his drink, Mike felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. A text from his former platoon mate, Tom Sullivan. "SEAL team reunion tonight at McPee's in Coronado. Heard from Martinez's brother that you're in town. Come by if you're up for it. Several of us here. All welcome." Mike smiled slightly. Tom had transitioned to the SEALs after their first deployment together and had excelled there. They'd stayed in touch over the years. That unspoken bond of combat, forged in the dust and danger of Afghanistan, keeping them connected despite their different paths. MCP's was a legendary SEAL hangout in Coronado, owned by a former SEAL himself. It was about 30 minutes away, across the bay. Mike considered the invitation. He had come out tonight to remember his fallen brothers after all. Perhaps it was fitting to do so among warriors who understood. The bartender slid the drink across the bar. $15. Mike raised an eyebrow at the price, but pulled out his wallet. As he placed a 20 on the bar, a group of 4 men in pressed shirts and designer jeans approached the bar beside him, jostling for position and ignoring his presence entirely. One bumped against his chair without acknowledgement. "Excuse me," Mike said evenly. The man, thick-necked with an expensive watch glinting on his wrist, glanced down with irritation. "Bar's packed, man. Maybe not the best place for—" He gestured vaguely at the wheelchair. Mike took a slow breath. He didn't want trouble, not tonight. "Just asking for some space." "Plenty of space outside." Another from the group chimed in, triggering chuckles from his companions. The bartender returned with Mike's change and overheard the exchange. Instead of intervening, he leaned forward and spoke in a low voice to Mike. "Look, I'm not trying to be a jerk here, but this is a high-volume night for us. The chair's blocking access to the bar, and we've got people trying to order." Mike looked at the nearly empty bar counter stretching in both directions. "There's plenty of room for everyone." The bartender's expression hardened. "I'm just saying, maybe this isn't the right venue for your situation. We don't really have accommodations for special needs." The term hit Mike like a physical blow. Special needs. As if he were a child who required extra attention, rather than a combat veteran who'd sacrificed his legs for his country. He felt heat rise in his neck and forced himself to remain calm. "I'm having one drink," Mike said, his voice level but firm, "to remember some friends who aren't here anymore. Then I'll be on my way." One of the men from the group snorted. "Jesus, playing the veteran card too. Classic." Mike turned to look at the man, really look at him, taking in the smug expression, the carefully styled hair, the absolute security of someone who had never faced real danger in his life. For a moment, he felt sorry for him. "It's not a card. It's my life." Mike raised his glass slightly. "To Coleman and Martinez. May they rest easy." He took a drink, determined to finish it quickly and leave. This wasn't the place to honor his fallen brothers. The group of men had turned their attention to a cluster of women further down the bar, but the bartender remained. his discomfort now mixed with visible annoyance. "Listen," he said, "the owner's pretty particular about the atmosphere we maintain here. We cater to a certain clientele. You understand? I'm going to have to ask you to finish up and move along." Mike stared at him, the implications clear. "You're asking me to leave because I'm in a wheelchair." The bartender glanced around nervously. "Keep your voice down, man. I'm just saying this isn't a good fit. We're not equipped for—" "I don't need equipment," Mike interrupted. "I need a drink and some basic human respect." The commotion had drawn the attention of a man in an expensive suit who approached with the confidence of authority. "Is there a problem here, Jason?" he asked the bartender. "No problem, Mr. Reeves. Just explaining to this gentleman that we're not really set up for wheelchairs, and it might be better if he found another establishment." The owner, Reeves, looked at Mike with a practiced, insincere smile. "I apologize for any inconvenience, sir, but we do have a responsibility to all our patrons and staff. The wheelchair creates a fire hazard in our limited space." Mike had heard enough. He placed his half-finished drink on the bar. "A fire hazard? That's what you're going with?" "Sir, I'm going to have to insist." "I'm leaving," Mike cut him off. "But let's be clear about what's happening here. You're discriminating against a disabled veteran on the anniversary of the day he lost his legs and his brothers in Afghanistan. That's what's happening right now." Reeves's smile disappeared. "Playing that card isn't going to work here. We have the right to refuse service to anyone disrupting our business." "Disrupting your business by existing. Got it." Mike began to back his wheelchair away from the bar. The group of men who had been rude earlier were watching the exchange with amusement. One of them called out, "Don't forget your pity party on the way out." That was when something in Mike snapped. 3 years of therapy, of learning to accept his new reality, of dealing with stares and awkward questions and well-meaning but condescending help. It all crystallized in that moment of naked disrespect. He spun his chair around. "What did you say to me?" The man, emboldened by alcohol and his friends, smirked. "You heard me, Wheels. Nobody cares about your sob story." Mike moved his chair forward, coming face to belt with the man. Looking up from the wheelchair had long ceased to feel demeaning to Mike, but he knew how it looked to others. The power dynamic clearly in their favor. He used it now, his voice deadly quiet. "My sob story includes pulling 3 of my men from a burning Humvee while under enemy fire. What's yours? Daddy bought you the wrong color BMW for your birthday?" The man's face flushed red. "Back off, cripple." The word hung in the air like a live grenade. Before Mike could respond, the bouncer appeared, summoned by the owner. "Time to go," he said firmly, positioning himself behind Mike's wheelchair. "Don't touch my chair," Mike warned, but the bouncer had already grabbed the handles and began pushing him toward the exit. For someone who had once prided himself on self-control, what happened next was uncharacteristic, but perhaps inevitable. Mike reached back and gripped the bouncer's wrist with crushing force, twisting it away from his chair. The man yelped in surprise and pain. "I said, don't touch my chair." Mike's voice was ice. The next moments happened in a blur. The bouncer called for help. The owner rushed over. The group of men stepped forward, suddenly brave in their numbers. Hands grabbed at Mike, at his chair, at his arms. Someone shouted about calling the police. Mike defended himself as best he could, but the disadvantage was obvious. Within minutes, Mike found himself on the sidewalk outside, his wheelchair roughly deposited beside him. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. A small crowd of patrons had gathered to watch. "You're banned for life," the owner called from the doorway. "Try to come back, and we'll have you arrested." Mike straightened his shirt, his face burning with humiliation, but his eyes dry. He'd endured worse. Much worse. He would endure this too. As the crowd dispersed and the door closed, Mike pulled out his phone. His hand was shaking slightly. From adrenaline, from anger, from a deep weariness that seemed to seep into his bones. He found Tom's text and replied, "On my way to McPee's. Could use some friendly faces tonight." 30 minutes later, Mike wheeled himself into McPee's Irish pub in Coronado. The contrast with the Lighthouse Lounge couldn't have been more stark. Where that establishment had been all pretension and exclusivity, McPee's was authentic and welcoming. Navy and SEAL memorabilia adorned the walls, not as decor, but as genuine tribute. Mike spotted Tom immediately. Still built like a tank, his dark hair cut close to his skull in typical operator fashion. Around him sat 6 other men, whose bearing and watchful eyes marked them as clearly as any uniform would have. Navy SEALs, active and former, gathered to remember their own. Tom saw Mike enter and rose immediately, crossing the room with long strides. "Hendricks, you ugly bastard," he called out, bending down to embrace Mike in the unabashed hug of warriors. "Wasn't sure you'd make it." "Wouldn't miss it," Mike replied, clasping his friend's arm. The simple human contact, free of pity or awkwardness, was like a balm. Tom's smile faded as he pulled back and noticed Mike's torn shirt and the red mark on his jawline that would likely bruise by morning. "What happened to you?" His voice had shifted to the tactical assessment tone Mike remembered from patrols. Mike hesitated. He hadn't come here to create problems or seek vengeance. He'd come to remember his fallen brothers among men who understood sacrifice. "Just a misunderstanding at another bar. Not worth talking about." Tom's eyes narrowed. He'd known Mike too long to be deflected. What kind of misunderstanding leaves marks like that? By now they had reached the table where the other SEALs were seated. A chair had already been removed to make space for Mike's wheelchair, a small courtesy done without fanfare or mention. One of the men, a granite-faced operator with a thick beard, slid a beer toward Mike. "For Coleman and Martinez," he said simply. "Tom told us why today matters." Mike nodded his thanks, touched by the gesture. But Tom wasn't letting go of what he'd seen. "Mike was just about to tell me how he got roughed up before coming here." 6 pairs of eyes, trained to observe the smallest details in the most chaotic environments, turned to Mike with focused attention. Mike sighed. "It's not a big deal. Some upscale place in the Gaslamp didn't appreciate having a guy in a wheelchair taking up space at their precious bar. Things got heated, and they threw me out. Literally." A dangerous silence fell over the table. These men, who had operated in environments where silence meant survival, communicated volumes without words. Glances were exchanged, jaws tightened. "Which bar?" asked one of the SEALs, a Latino man with scars visible on his forearms. "The Lighthouse Lounge. But listen, I didn't come here to—" "They put hands on you?" Tom interrupted, his voice deceptively casual. Mike hesitated. "Yes, but because you're in a wheelchair." This from another SEAL, his southern accent thick with controlled anger. "That, and because I didn't appreciate being called a cripple by some trust fund kids at the bar." The temperature around the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. These were men accustomed to careful planning, to measured responses, to action rather than words. And something was clearly being planned in the wordless communication passing between them. "Mike," Tom said carefully, "we're here to remember Coleman and Martinez, to honor their sacrifice, and yours. I know that's why I came. Then you understand that we can't let this stand." Tom looked around the table, receiving nods of agreement. "It dishonors everything they died for." Mike started to protest, but fell silent. There was a code among them, unspoken but binding. An attack on one was an attack on all. Disrespect to a brother, especially one who had sacrificed as Mike had, could not go unanswered. "We're not going to start a bar fight," Tom assured him, reading his concern. "We're professionals. We're just going to have a conversation with the management about their customer service policies." "Mer?" Mike looked at the determined faces around him and recognized the futility of arguing. These men, the elite of the elite, had made their decision. And despite himself, a small part of him wanted to see what would happen when the pampered clientele of the Lighthouse Lounge met the men who had carried the weight of America's most dangerous missions on their shoulders. "Just a conversation," Mike said finally. "No one gets hurt." Tom's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course not. We're just going to educate them." What happened when those Navy SEALs walked into the Lighthouse Lounge 30 minutes later is now legend in San Diego's Gaslamp Quarter. No punches were thrown. No threats were made. But the power and presence of 8 combat veterans, men who had faced death in the world's most dangerous places, created a silence that spoke volumes. They simply stood there, surrounding Mike's wheelchair, as Tom calmly explained to the owner exactly how federal law protects disabled Americans from discrimination, and how disrespecting a man who had lost his legs in service to his country reflected on the establishment's values. By the end of the night, the bar had a new policy regarding accessible seating, and a framed apology letter now hangs beside the cash register, a daily reminder that the freedom they enjoy in serving drinks and making money was paid for with the blood and sacrifices of men like Mike Hendricks. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Honor Echoes right now. Every subscription helps us continue telling these powerful stories of service, sacrifice, and the unbreakable brotherhood that binds our veterans together. Remember, freedom isn't free, and neither is respect. Sometimes it takes a Navy SEAL team showing up at your door to remind you of that fact.